Before I really get started, let's just give you a little bit of backstory about my experience with it. I read the novel not long after it originally came out. I remember feeling deeply disappointed at a number of points in the novel. It's a sprawling story, it's long, and it's kind of lazy. That was my initial impression. The monster being whatever scared you the most, which is the surface level story, really felt like it had been done a lot in the genre in the late 80s. And especially in literature, where Stephen King was ruling the roost, it felt like a lot of what King had done before. There was just a group of friends that were somewhat estranged, a passage of time, returning to your old hometown. There was elements of Salem's Lot that were pretty explicit to the material. There was also the size and scope of the stand, seemingly, in it. Even though we weren't talking about a global threat, it certainly felt like it had that wide of a canvas to work from. But I also remember not feeling very connected to it compared to the previous novels. I was a big fan of Stephen King, and that would still continue after it for a couple more years, until I found other artists whose work I actually liked more. But in the meantime, it seemed like a big hiccup, but one that oddly was extremely popular. I remember people talking about it as his masterpiece, and that was completely opposite of my impressions. So keep in mind, as we go forward, that I am not a fan of the story of it. This is not a review of that novel. This is a review of the second part of the second series of films made from that novel. I'm not going to fault the movie for my feelings about the book, but I will fault it in storytelling in general when I feel that that storytelling doesn't hold up. 2 years ago, I, like apparently everyone else on the planet, or at least in North America, went to go see the first half of the story, It Chapter 1. And I went in with some reservation. Again, the original novel is not one of my favorites, and I was pleasantly surprised. It was way better than I expected, and it was actually very solid in its thematics. And where I felt sometimes it exaggerated and where it didn't need to, everything they did still serviced the story just fine. I would say that It, Chapter 1, is a better-than-average horror film made from a less-than-average novel. So going into It Chapter 2, it was my hope that we would get something at least as good as the original, but I had my suspicions. Even from the novel, I knew that the stronger side of the story was the kid's side. The adult side was always the weaker side. With all that out of the way, let's get on to It Chapter 2. The movie opens with a brutal assault sequence, which is undercut by the fact that the assailants are portrayed as caricatures. They feel more like someone's politically rendered version of small-town Americans, small-minded, petty, than real characters. It's unfortunate because the sequence otherwise is an incredibly sober, violent attack, and the idea that Pennywise is a representation of that kind of violence in our real world could have been a strong theme. We'll get to what the themes of the novel are in a moment. This would be a more reasonable analog for today's audiences with today's sensitivities. Following the assault, we start on the story proper. And we never really reference that beginning again, other than to suggest that it is part of a tapestry of crimes that have been committed that the clown has been involved in. A few phone calls later, we are reintroduced to the Losers Club. And we don't like any of them. At least I didn't. I found them all to be shallow, rich, entitled people who I couldn't really care about, all doing their dream jobs. They really had no reason to return to Derry other than this pact they made as kids. And even then, considering their wealth and the fact that they are pretty shallow characters, we don't really buy that they would go back. I have a basic rule for horror films in particular that says that if your heroes walk back into danger knowing they're walking back into danger, the audience has just been given license to not care what happens to those characters. And emotionally, we don't. We never connect with these adult characters the way we did with the kids, because the kids were approachable. We felt like these were kids that perhaps we didn't know in our hometowns, but we could have. Also, it's worth keeping in mind that for those of us who read the novel decades ago and watched the first film once and kind of shrugged and said, well, that was better than I thought it would be, we're not so invested in the characters that we can necessarily tell them apart well enough in their adult incarnations. I was constantly trying to figure out, wait, is this the kid that was overweight? Or was this the other kid? Was this the smart kid? Oh wait, That's the Jewish kid, right? There's an assumption by the filmmakers that we know these characters in the story better than I think a lot of us really do. And while we might be invested, and while you may be invested, I really wasn't. As I said earlier, the adult material in the novel is far weaker than the kids' story. And that's really true here. The Chinese restaurant scene has always been the weakest scene in the novel as far as I'm concerned. It was the weakest scene in the miniseries version, and it's the weakest scene here. There's never really a threat. It's not particularly gross. The special effects are not convincing. Oh, let's talk about special effects for a moment. Why does everything look awful? The first film didn't always pull off its special effects, but it at least had enough atmosphere and mood to pull through. Here, everything looks plastic, fake, overly CGI. Nothing really ever looks like it's in frame. The lighting is often wrong with the CGI characters. It all looks slapdashed, and I have seen better CGI on television commercials. And I don't watch much television. I've often said that special effects do not make or break a movie, that the storytelling will overcome bad special effects. Here, there's not enough story. When you take the whole 2 hours and 45 minutes and try and tell me what happens during the film, you'll be surprised about how quickly you can do so. It's not even a paragraph. It's just quick ramble of sentences, and that's pretty much it. So we need to talk about what it really is. And this is that birds and the bees conversation that every parent fears giving their kid. It is a coming-of-age novel, masquerading as a horror novel. It, the title character, isn't a clown or a space spider or anything else. It is just human sexuality. Think about it for a moment. What in every kid's life is the thing their parents refuse to recognize in them, but they become fixated upon? What frightens children the most, besides the changes in their own bodies and their attitudes towards their friends? The novel is often very frank with this depiction of adolescent sexuality, and it becomes almost impossible to imagine filming any version of that story as presented in the novel. So I don't blame the filmmakers for not including that scene in the caves. But, by the same rate, the film still has to be about something. And as it stands right now, it never really commits to being about anything. Instead, it becomes about gathering together trinkets from your past that really mean nothing, and then sacrificing them for what reason exactly? But the actual resolution of this movie could have been done at any point. The whole ritual of Chud becomes meaningless because of a decision the filmmakers make. And that decision, by the way, mirrors the opening scene, but not in a flattering way. In fact, in a way that probably is pretty offensive, and definitely flies in the face of the logic of the novel. It Chapter 2 is a disaster. It took the goodwill from the first film and essentially smeared your face in it. It's overlong, it's droning, it's unsuccessful, it's slapdash, it's meaningless. It Chapter 2 is not the worst horror film to come out this year. It's not even the worst horror film to come out probably this month. But what it is an insult to a lot of fans who invested very deeply in a story that they really hoped was the salvation of the horror genre. It's not. It never has been. It's always been a popular story, but it's never really deserved its title at the top of the heap. And Pennywise, as an icon, is barely in this. And when he is in this, he's mostly CGI, and unconvincing CGI at that. There's not a lot of good reasons to suggest this movie. In fact, I can't really come up with any. I wish I had my 2 hours and 45 minutes back. The film ends with a visual reference to A Nightmare on Elm Street Part 5, and there's something really reasonable about that. Just like that movie, it has lots of ideas brimming under the surface, but doesn't know what to do with any of them. Just like that film, it feels oddly cheaper than it really was. And just like that movie, it ultimately is something you have to dredge up a memory even to remember. And considering how memorable the first part of it was, that's unmistakably a failure.